네, 기후 위기를 주제로
With the theme on climate change, we are hosting the first 2022 ESG conference. So we will begin the opening. We will have the afternoon session from now. And in the afternoon session, we have 2 different sessions and 1 special session. So first session for the afternoon is ESG investment session. We will invite ESG specialized experts and investors, and we will talk about investing based on ESG standards. The first speaker is Professor Kerry Krasinski. So we will invite him to this room. He's connected online. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. And as we have the slides ready, you can begin your presentation whenever you want.
Fantastic. Well, wish I could be with you, but it's great to be with you this way. I'm hearing myself on an echo. I don't know if that can be removed, but anyway, just a brief amount of information about myself. I would invite you all to connect with me on LinkedIn if that's of interest, but I'm a lecturer at Brown since 2016, at Yale since 2014, and as you can see from the slides, NYU as well. I have 7 books out on sustainable investing, some of them considered seminal, going back to 2008. And I also act as a senior advisor in a number of capacities, but you can see more about me at LinkedIn if that's of interest. But what I really want to do is talk to you about the misunderstandings that we see around ESG that are increasingly proliferating. And so what are 10 common misunderstandings? First of all, and we'll get into this a bit more, I'll be speaking to you for just a few minutes as we have other speakers, but ESG are issues. It's not a single thing. We have to stop calling ESG a single thing, and we'll get back into why we're saying that shortly. Also, data sometimes can help, but not always. An example would be the diversity of boards, for example. That's a clear case where if you have information and you want to act on that information, it could be useful. However, number 3, ESG data has a history of being oversold, and we have to be honest and sincere about this, and we're seeing increasing calls about greenwashing, and we have to make sure we are using information and not just gathering information for its sake. Standards can help, and there's work going on right now on international sustainability standards, but we have to be clear on what these standards are and are not, and what they can and cannot do. And that also includes the work happening in the EU on taxonomy, and also what the SEC is proposing in its climate disclosure rule. And the same is true of the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. We have to be clear about what these things are and what they are not. They're not designed to solve the entire challenges that we face. All of that said, we welcome transparency and increases in disclosure requirements, such as that SEC disclosure rule and the SFDR in Europe. Even if they are works in progress, they encourage activity. We've seen that firsthand in the US with corporates and investors at senior levels. The same is true of net zero commitments, even though we don't really know what that looks like. It's a useful thing to try to encourage progress. But we have to be careful about what we mean by these phrases. And number 8, sometimes investing can help when it comes to ESG issues, but not always. And so we have to stop using the phrase ESG investing. Sustainability is a perfectly good word. Impact is a perfectly good word, but the phrase ESG investing doesn't mean anything. I don't know why that's become the phrase that people are using. We have to stop that. Accusations of greenwashing are a good thing because this work is critical, as we'll see in a minute. It's not a bad thing. We have to be clear about what we're actually doing and act as investors if we think we're really going to make a positive difference. And there are ways for sustainable investing to be effective and transformational, but we have to be brutally honest about what works and what doesn't work. We need to change systems. That requires case studies of what's working that can be scaled for purpose. And this is important because, as I mentioned, ESG are issues. ESG is not a thing. You're seeing some of the issues on the screen in front of you. If you've been to parts of Asia like China and India, you'll know that these cities have poor air quality more often than not. These are tangential and experiential when you actually taste the air that you're breathing. Biodiversity is a serious issue. And obviously the carbon footprint of everything is complicated because of scope 3 supply chain issues. The resiliency of our planet from climate change is only going to get more serious. You've had tremendous rainfall in Korea. You'll know well what I'm talking about. Each of these are issues, and they're both risks and opportunities. We only solve these issues when we turn them into opportunities. And we like to extend the ESG acronym to include F, or the business case, because nothing is sustainable or scalable unless there's a business case. And it's philanthropy if there isn't a business case. So we have to understand if our investments will be successful financially. And we like to split out Q, or the quality of management, separate from the more technical measures of governance that you're seeing on the right part of this slide. These are issues. ESG is not a single thing. We can choose to deal with these issues or we can not deal with them. There are ramifications to not dealing with them. They're all important issues to someone, somewhere. And perhaps the most important slide and concept I can leave with you is the fact that sustainable investing, if you must call it ESG investing, feel free. But what we like to call sustainable investing, or the 7 tribes of sustainable investing, it is not one thing. This is not one field. There is not one thing called ESG investing or sustainable investing or impact investing for that matter. There are 7 distinct separate strategies. Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimates that this will represent over 50 trillion US dollars in a couple of years. And these 7 different strategies are important to understand because they really are very different, and they actually perform differently as well, both financially as well as whether they actually have impacts as is desired by those who make these investments. And so the first thing to recognize is that sustainable investing is not just screening out companies you don't like. It is where the field started. It started with negative screening, finding companies that perhaps were violating SEC rules in the US or otherwise polluting or hiding pollution, or what in the UK is called ethical investing, or matching religious mandates to investing, or just tell me what you don't want me to invest in and otherwise let me get on with my job. A values first approach. Much of the $35 trillion that you see talked about is in this category. Large pension funds that only screen out a couple of issues. The classic is not wanting to invest in tobacco or firearms or pornography or gambling. This is very much the 1.0 of the field, what used to be called socially responsible investing. And actually the financial performance of negative screening, generally speaking, is quite poor. If you just invest in a benchmark, you tend to do better than taking the same benchmark and just subtracting out a few companies or a few sectors. And so this leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. Since 2008, when we've been writing about the field, we've been trying to get people to take a more positive approach. We prefer a positive or best-in-class type of value-first investment, which is, one might estimate, is around $5 trillion today. Generation Investment Management, Al Gore and David Blood's firm, would be a classic case that we teach from, kind of the 2.0 of sustainable investing, trying to take sustainability issues into account, but also financial conditions of the companies you're investing in. These strategies often outperform benchmark after fees, such as Generation did over their first 10 years. We think this has enormous potential in Asia as ESG issues become more seriously dealt with. There'll be lots of opportunities in Asia from this perspective, but that's a completely opposite approach to what you see with negative screening. You're only choosing companies to invest in, and increasingly across asset class. Separate again, impact investing, which includes community investing. It's approaching $1 trillion. It's something of the 3.0. And when we teach about impact measurement and how investors like TPG and others are increasingly trying to have incremental societal benefit, helping people, typically those less well off, improve the quality of their lives, pull people out of poverty. A country such as China has solved poverty, as I'm sure we know from a technical standpoint. But there's a lot of potential, even in China and across Asia, for more impact investing to not only solve problems for those less well off, but also to make a reasonable amount of money. Again, a completely different category of investment from the first two tribes of sustainable investing. Different again is thematic investing across asset class. Here's where you see things like water infrastructure investing or renewable energy project finance starting to approach $1 trillion a year with large commitments from banks. And here's where the opportunity is. We're about 3, maybe 5 times underinvested in the renewable energy transition. If we could scale this asset class up, that would be the sort of work that would really make a difference, especially if we had country roadmaps for the transition that's required. So big opportunity and a lot of action happening in the thematic category. We're also, we helped start a newsletter called Climate Tech VC, which is enormously successful. It's free. We'd encourage you to take a look at that. So thematic investing is really where you see innovation, you see renewable energy scaled, a lot of activity across the board. Again, totally different than the first 3 tribes. So we don't understand why people try to evaluate this field as if it's one thing, let alone the fact that the financial performance will vary also by fund manager. There's a difference between doing these, taking these strategies into account in a quality way, or just kind of doing it in a way which is greenwashing. And that's what you often see, sadly, in the ESG integration category. The principles for responsible investment have over $100 trillion of asset managers, and there's about $500 trillion in the world in global value and tradable assets. So here's where you see what the large firms tend to be doing, buying in data from multiple sources, creating algorithms, and trying to make use of that in different ways. Again, a different approach to the first 4. And then you see, of course, shareholder engagement, where things like the Climate Action 100 Plus has over $50 trillion of assets, gathering together to engage with large companies on issues such as climate and increasingly nature as well. Again, a totally different approach. And then last but not least, minimum standards. My personal favorite, one that we've worked with New York State Common, one of the largest pension funds in the United States, and Yale, which has established minimum standards on fossil fuel. If you visit a restaurant in New York, there's a letter on the window telling you whether the food is safe to eat. Now, why wouldn't you want that on investing as well? Yet we haven't had that, and so it's great to see that that work is starting to progress. We think minimum standards has tremendous potential in Asia. Again, a very different category of strategy. And so I'm going to leave it here because I think we're going to go 15 minutes each to start. But I hope this was a useful introduction, and I look forward to the other speakers that we have next.
Professor. Thank you for your insights, and we'll be looking forward to hear more at the panel discussion. 네, 고맙습니다. 10가지의 오해를 바로 잡아주셨고요. 또 관련
So he corrected 10 misunderstandings. And moving on to the second presentation, we'll invite Mr. Thomas Fallow, who is a global financial consultant. He has a profile of investment consulting in Hong Kong and Seoul and many other major cities in Asia. I think he is here with us online.
Hello?
Yes, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. And as the slides are ready, please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you very much. Let me get started here. 1 second. First of all, I'm very happy to be in this gathering. 안녕하세요. 저는 Tom Fallows입니다. 저는 Soleil 있었어요. I used to live in Seoul. I was there from the year 2000 to 2005, and I remain a good friend of Korea. So what I'm going to address here today is very interested in Carrie's comments from an academic point of view. I have an academic background, but more recently, for the last 30 years, 40 years, I've been working as a businessman and a banker and investor. So that's the perspective I'm going to be talking about. A few words about me. First of all, I am looking at ESG from my personal experience point of view, starting out as an historian, but then I've been a bank practitioner for many decades, also as an investor. So my perspective, I do hear an echo here, by the way. I don't know how to get rid of that, but in any case, my perspective combines business, finance, and economics. As Carrie mentioned, I have the same view that ESG per se is not a very helpful concept, especially ESG invest. As Carrie had mentioned, I think this is something that's not very useful. What is especially important from my point of view as an investor is that you want to invest in assets that are generating business. And so this is where I see a fundamental difference between E versus S and G. From my point of view, S and G are fantastic, but they are risk mitigants. They are helping you, a company or helping a nation pursue good goals, but it's not generating a new business. It's not generating new revenues. It's a cost, actually, if you think about it. By contrast, in the E aspect of ESG is an area where you have new technologies, new sources of revenues, and particularly infrastructure finance is a place where, from an investor point of view, you can actually generate new business opportunities. Now, Carrie had mentioned the religious and moral aspect of ESG. This also very much came to mind from my own experience. 8 years in Saudi Arabia, you cannot work there without having a good feel for Islamic finance. And from my point of view, Islamic finance is very similar to ESG finance. From the way Carrie described it in the 1.0 initial phase of ESG financing, which is screening out, eliminating sinful assets. And this is something that's very much a aspect of Islamic financing. If we were in the 14th century, we could look at Christian investing. Anytime you're doing a sin avoidance filter, you're taking a religious moral point of view. And I think anyone who looks at this, and Kerry was mentioning himself as well, if you're taking a asset screening and negative screening approach, you're going to have a more narrow range of assets to invest in than you would if you were a totally blind, indifferent investor from a moral point of view. And one good example would be in the gaming sector in Asia. Could you imagine if you said from an investor point of view, you don't want to invest in casinos in Macau or Singapore. That's not a very good financial decision. Singapore, Macau gaming institutions are very profitable, but if you have a religious point of view, you would not invest in that business. And so taking the asset filter, the negative filter approach, you're going to limit your financial opportunities. Now, one thing that from a, again, investor point of view, given that view, ESG finance is a social cause. It's a very good social cause. It's very useful. It's very important for helping making a better environment, but it's not necessarily an investment asset. It's a brand. And so when I look at various financial companies, corporate advertising and so on, it's clear that ESG is a very big part of the corporate advertising approach of feel good about your company. Now, in terms of where the opportunities are, they are primarily, in my opinion, in the infrastructure finance area, combating global warming and having various issues. From a capitalist point of view, you'd say capitalism means no government support. You do it all through the market. But I, as an historian, am impressed by the very critical role played by governments in promoting important developments. Mercantilism of how North America was developed and populated by Europeans is all a big story about the government support, government driving activity. German, Russian, Japan developments, the same thing, the government was driving it. You think of the capitalistic no government USA, what was very important was the American government driving things such as the Transcontinental Railroad. Very important professor from Harvard University Business School. We talk about the visible hand of American government behind business. And so business is very much in partnership with the government. And it all comes down to how does the palace pay for development? It pays for it through taxes. And taxes, typically from a business point of view, are negative. We don't like taxes. But if you think about it, there is a need for the fire department, for public services, schools, and combating climate change, I think, is another good, useful benefit. So there's government support out there. The U.S. government's recent congressional legislation is a good example of this. But the area of concern for me is with regard to early stage technologies. Now, as a businessman, I know a lot of small business entrepreneurs, and they give the same skeptical view that I've had, which is ESG is common sense. It's just doing the right thing. And further, from my personal point of view, Carrie mentioned greenwashing. I lived through this very clearly of the tick the box kind of approach that was taken in the Middle East, where various Middle Eastern banks would be in competition to say, who's the best ESG finance? And I was the guy who had to write the memo saying, yes, we're very ESG, we're very green because we did this, and we did that, and you do everything to label yourself green, but all you're doing is just looking within your existing activities, what you would have done anyway, and then you say, oh, I was financing a real estate project. Now I'm doing something good for society. I did a petrochemical project for Saudi Aramco. I'm doing something good for the environment. It's just tick the box. And so this is something where there is skepticism that's very understandable from the way ESG compliance and reporting is practiced, in my opinion. Now, from a bank's, so that was a critical comment I just made about ESG, but I also see the benefits. And this is part of also my personal experience in Citigroup. And I find the example of how sensitivity to your local society, sensitivity to your stakeholders does help create good social consequences. I was in Italy in the 1980s, and I remember greeting the vice chairman of Citicorp at the time, who just flown in from Johannesburg. And he just had announced that Citicorp was exiting South Africa due to apartheid. Why was Citigroup giving up their business in South Africa to fight apartheid? Well, there was pressure from the shareholders. CalPERS, as a major shareholder at Citicorp at the time, putting on pressure. So ESG does have political and social impact. In Citibank, I was very much involved in project financing. And I remember when Citigroup at the time, project finance experts were launching the Equator Principles. This was another example of how you have shareholder concerns, public pressure, environmental concerns in Ecuador for an oil and gas project. And then Citibank came up excuse me, with the Equator Principles to guide a framework for good, healthy, and project financing for the environment. Risk mitigation obviously was also very important for the various measures after the Enron scandals and so on. I myself in Korea was very much involved with the Hynex refinancing in the early 2000s. And this to me is also an example of how it's very important as a bank that you look to see where the government, banks, economy, and society are all working together. In that case was to protect the semiconductor industry in Korea, which is similar to what U.S. Congress is doing in the chips industry in the United States. Now, as an investor, this is something that has been interesting for me more recently in the last 5 years when I've been in New York. So I've talked with other investor friends, and they basically gave two messages. One is I'm very skeptical about the ESG as an investor. I don't really believe in it. And secondly, go read The Economist. And so if you check in last month's The Economist, they had a special supplement on ESG investments, and it's very critical. And it has a very clear roadmap of all the changes that are required. Now, what I'm trying to do is show the wealth of different perspectives. I also have some friends, some very close friends who've been very much involved with the international exchanges, whether the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, CAC 40, the Frankfurt Exchange, London Exchange, and so on. From that point of view, if you're a regulator following the exchanges, from that point of view, G is the king, which was very surprising to me because obviously I have a bias toward new business generation. From a regulator point of view, G, governance, is what's the most important thing. And this friend was talking about his close work with the regulators in Taiwan and how important the integrated reporting approach has been very important for the exchanges dealing with quote listed companies. So you have the International Accounting Standards Board, the International Sustainability Standards Board, the IFRS foundations, all pushing for integrated reporting and that show that the value of a company is not just financial. It's the broader issues create the true value of the company. Now, my friend has concerns here. First of all, we had great statistics from Kerry on the trillions of assets going into ESG investments, ESG, what assets we all call ESG. But the fund managers really have no resources to really analyze it. And there are cases if you count up the staff in BlackRock to follow all the companies they follow in their portfolio, it's roughly 15 minutes per annual report. Per company. It's just way too superficial. The same thing with governance concerns for the boards. The boards are supposed to be very adept at using risk mitigation models, and the boards often don't exercise the discipline required to do that. So from a regulator's point of view, the lack of depth, lack of real analysis is still a problem. Now, another person I know is a close advisor to a number of major global companies. And so he gave the example of Rio Tinto. And this is also related to what Kerry was talking about of impact stock versus feel-good ESG kind of stocks. So he raises the question, why is it the main companies in ESG indices are service companies? Service companies aren't polluting. It's the manufacturing companies, which is where all the emissions are created, not with Facebook and Apple and so on. You have to look at the real polluters. And what's important is to do it on a sector by sector basis. So if you're looking at all companies in the world and a broad ESG portfolio, you're not going to get the kind of granular analysis that you need. So this person was saying, imagine for Rio Tinto as a mining company, if they are number 73 in the ESG index, it doesn't mean anything. But if you have a mining specific ESG index, who are the biggest polluters, who are the lowest polluters? And if Rio Tinto comes out to be number 10 versus number 1, that makes a big difference for shareholder action. So the emphasis is on having peer-by-peer analysis of ESG by sector. One thing that's important, we'll talk about decarbonization, that's a concern for me, is these major companies like the Rio Tintos. They have existing assets, existing production facilities that are needing to be decarbonized. And so all the technology efforts are being on revamping existing equipment. You're not really looking at brand new technology. If you're trying to redress your existing technology, it's going to take you a lot longer to leapfrog into the future compared to with having greenfield, brand new, fresh technology. Now, I took a look at also at various materials of surveys of the investment interest in industry and what types of measurements. That's the problem. The measurements suck. The measurements are not very useful. And looking at the types of comments in this presentation, you can see a lot of it is just feel-good kind of personalized subjective measurements that are really not very useful. And so it's really that for the impact is only that comment at the very bottom, which is something that's not very relevant. So that the impact is where you have relevant statistics that should be measured. Decarbonization is the flavor of the month, not just flavor of the month, it's what we need to survive as a planet. Everybody's talking about decarbonization. Now, how do we get there? And this again is my point. If the big existing companies with all the capital, the resources to invest, are working on upgrading existing production methods, again, how is this going to help us through technology? We work closely in the firm where I work, Galileo Global Securities, with a venture capital fund based in Canada called Chrysalix Venture Capital. They have a new fund, Carbon Neutrality Fund, which is looking for startup new technologies. And there are a variety of messages that Chrysalix has in terms of how to help early stage companies. First of all, we have to be very aggressive doing it now if you're going to reach your 2050 targets. Secondly, you identify the new technologies that are needed. And if you look at the currency, you look at this chart, 25% of the technologies are with mature technologies, the stuff that Rio Tinto does. The remaining 75% are technologies that are really not proven yet. And this is precisely where you need the early stage investment. And most VC funding is at a later stage. Now, why is that from a VC funding from a later stage? It's obvious from my experience. Just like with bankers, they want to look at historical track record, historical performance, proven commercializability. Then you look forecast forward. If you don't have commercial success yet, the venture capital is not very coming, and I'll give you some examples. So how to get to decarbonization, one thing would be great would be to electrify the aviation industry. And this is one case where I myself am an investor. I support this company and I'm very impressed with management. This would be the first FAA approved all electric airplane. Approach me if you want to get more information on it. But you see the website there, by Aerospace based in Colorado. My point there is they are very slowly working on capital raising. And you see the valuations that have been given in the market for EV, for electric vehicles in automobiles and trucking, and it hasn't been applied yet in aviation. So I think there's a good arbitrage opportunity. Now here's another case where capital raising is ongoing, but it's not easy, which is in the solar world. Now, what could be a better resource for solar energy than doing a solar plant operation in a desert? Living in Riyadh for 8 years, I lived in a desert a long time, and there's plenty of sun. The problem, however, is there's also plenty of sand, and sand destroys and really degrades the quality of the solar panel on electrical generation. A startup company that I know very well, GlassPoint is its name. They have invented new technology. It's been proven in Oman. They've now entered into a long-term contract with Ma'aden, the mining company of Saudi Arabia, to have heat-generating steam production facilities going into an aluminum smelting operation in the desert in Saudi. With zero emissions. And so this is something that's very useful, but the company is working hard to get early stage financing. Another example I have is in the steel industry. A Canadian company that I've met, very, very innovative, a great vision. You look at steel industry, which is probably the worst case for emissions. They have a way to use hydrogen to create the heat for the blast furnaces instead of coal. This would be fantastic, but this is a multi-billion-dollar project to create steel out of hydrogen and green steel. So I have two conclusions. As remember, I've been talking about two different types of ESG financing for listed companies and for startups. For listing companies, the issue is the reporting metrics, the rating scale. Is it meaningful? Does it say, as Carrie mentioned, ESG invest does not really make sense. You should drill down and get more specific. And so we think that that's something that's a consensus I hear from people who follow listed companies. From the unlisted companies, the high risk early stage companies, we need them for the technological innovation, but we need help. And I think the use of carbon credits and carbon exchanges as a way to create government support in a market-driven way is going to be the path. And so I very strongly support the recent initiative by U.S. Congress to have more credits for the industry. So in conclusion, I say, 감사합니다. Thank you very much for your attention. And what I'd like to hear in the discussion is what's the Korean focus on ESG? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. And regarding the topic that you're interested in, maybe we can deal it in the panel discussion. So please stay tuned. 네, 비즈니스 관점에서 ESG 관련된 생각 그리고 사례들을 공유해 주셨습니다.
Thank you for sharing great insights and opinions on this issue. And the third speaker for this session is Senior Policy Manager of Bartek Cizerski of ERCST.
Good morning. My name is Bartek Cizerski. I'm a Senior Policy Manager in ERCST, which stands for European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. We are an independent think tank based in Brussels. We conduct research on international and EU climate policies. And thank you very much for the invitation to this interesting conference on a very timely topic. I'm grateful for the opportunity to present a European perspective to the role of ESG for the climate, and especially in the context of the European Green Deal. What will I talk about specifically? First, I will explain what the European Green Deal is and what are its implications. Then I will bring you up to date with the concept of sustainable finance and the taxonomy and its role for the European Green Deal. And finally, I will briefly mention the latest developments in the EU, namely qualification of gas and nuclear energy as green activities under the EU taxonomy. So let's start with the question, what is the European Green Deal? It's basically a political commitment and plan to make Europe a neutral climate continent by 2050. This political commitment has been turned into a legally binding commitment to reach net zero by 2050 and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. And it has been implemented by the EU climate law in 2021. Those two commitments, political and legal, have been followed by a set of many and parallel legislative actions, which are to implement those commitments in specific areas, like for Fit for 55 or Repower EU. This requires a huge climate environment and environmental effort on every possible front for businesses and for citizens. And this level of decarbonization is, of course, not possible by continuing business as usual. We must deploy new approaches, new technologies. However, the estimated cost of implementation of those objectives in the EU exceeds 300 billion euro yearly by 2050, and these are very conservative estimates. Where to take this money from is a big question. For sure, it requires not only engaging public, but also private funding. And here is where the concept of sustainable finance and taxonomy steps in. Sustainable finance refers to the process of taking account environmental, social, and governance considerations, known under acronym of ESG, when making investment decisions in the financial sector. The EU taxonomy is a flagship of the EU Sustainable Finance Strategy, and it is also a part of the European Green Deal framework. Taxonomy was adopted in 2020 by the EU institutions as a classification system. This system is supposed to give guidance to investors which economic activities contributed significantly to environmental objectives. It establishes 6 such objectives related to climate, biodiversity, circular economy, water protection, pollution prevention, and control. The declared goal of taxonomy is to direct the flow of private capital to finance transition towards a sustainable economy, but at the same time, to avoid the misuse of sustainability claims known as greenwashing. But it is not just a classification tool. There is also a reporting obligation. Specifically, non-financial companies undertakings must disclose the proportion of their economic activities that fulfill the EU taxonomy criteria. And financial market participants, like asset managers and credit institutions, should disclose the proportion of their investments or credit exposure to taxonomy-aligned economic activities in the value of all their investments and assets. EU institutions and member states must also use taxonomy criteria when designing financial instruments labeled as green, for example, the EU Green Bond Standards. But it is only one of the disclosure tools that create a framework for sustainable finance in the EU. We'll have soon a corporate sustainability reporting directive, which will require disclosure from all large companies about the overall impact on sustainability. We have also sustainable finance disclosure regulation, which is designed for financial market participants, and also the corporate sustainable due diligence directive, which is being currently considered by the European legislators, which will force companies to take responsibility for the human rights and environmental impacts along their value chain, also outside of the EU. All those disclosure tools link in many ways with the taxonomy. Now, how to be labeled green under the taxonomy? Basically, an undertaking must fulfill 3 conditions. First and foremost, it must meet screening criteria for a specific environmental objective. Secondly, it must fulfill so-called minimal social standards. Those standards are described in OECD guidelines and several UN conventions. And thirdly, it must make sure that that the company does not harm to any other environmental objective. For certain activities, the criteria for being labeled are less stringent. It is possible for transitional activities, that is, activities for which there is currently no economically nor technologically available low carbon alternative. And it is also possible for activities which enable a significant environmental contribution to other activities. So where do taxonomy criteria come from? Criteria are drafted by 50 experts from NGOs and business community, sitting at the platform of sustainable finance, which is an advisory body of the European Commission. But actually, those criteria are adopted by the Commission, sometimes with certain modifications. But then such an act is scrutinized by the European Parliament and member states, but they have no possibility to modify such an act. They just take it or leave it. Over the years, the market has been developing many tools to report on ESG, but as you see, the taxonomy represents a big involvement of public institutions in this field. And this is a visible shift towards a regulatory approach rather than market approach to this area, which becomes a significant trend. And this brings certain consequences. What are they? First and foremost, the regulatory approach to the taxonomy translates into its spillover to many other EU policies. I mentioned already EU Green Bond Standards, and there are also other financial instruments like EU Ecolabel, which are expected to rely on the taxonomy criteria. But there is also a significant impact of taxonomy on the EU public funding, where the taxonomy becomes an important benchmark. For example, the European Investment Bank committed to aligning its lending policy with the taxonomy framework. The taxonomy has become also a frequent reference for sustainability in the EU strategies, like the strategy on chemicals, steel, agriculture, textiles, or even in concrete legal acts using its thresholds for the definition of renewable hydrogen, for example. Many undertakings have already begun voluntary reporting based on the taxonomy, and we can see a significant interest in the taxonomy-related assets on the financial market. So, as we see, there's a lot of enthusiasm about the taxonomy, but there are also some question marks related to this. First and foremost, they're related to challenges in reporting on the basis of taxonomy, because it requires entirely new set of data, which have been previously unreported and are not readily available, and which contain also many new notions and definitions. There's also a fear of the binary interpretation of the taxonomy, meaning that activities which cannot be classified as sustainable are harmful. And there is an anxiety about the possible impact on availability and the cost of capital, as well as possible reputational damages of such a binary reading of the taxonomy. This anxiety is reinforced by the fact that the EU taxonomy reformulates very demanding criteria, which very likely will allow only a small percentage of the EU economic activities to be labeled as green. The taxonomy, being a product of public institutions and politicians, not necessarily of market participants, became a political label, provoking political tensions. Using this label to one or another economic activity became a matter of principle and a matter of politics. And a good illustration of this phenomena are the political emotions around recent qualifying gas and nuclear energy as green activities under the taxonomy. Where those emotions come from? This recent intense discussion in the EU about gas and nuclear in taxonomy, in fact, reflected different views about the model of energy transition in the EU and the role of gas and nuclear energy in it. For some people, gas as a fossil fuel and nuclear energy, with all the risks related to nuclear waste management, simply do not belong to the concept of sustainable activity, and they do not belong to future. In some member states and their constituencies, there are also strong anti-nuclear sentiments. For others, gas should be phased out as soon as possible. And the sentiment grows stronger with Russia attacking Ukraine and complications related to the fact that EU is trying to limit its dependence on Russian gas. They also argue that encouraging investors to engage funds in such projects will distract investments from the renewable energy. But there is also another line of argument, namely that gas and nuclear energy are important elements of transition from coal, and being out of the taxonomy may cut off financing of such projects. Arguably, renewable energy investments will never have a problem with attracting capital, and coverage of gas and nuclear projects by the taxonomy will help to recognize the transitional role of those activities and to finance them. So what specifically the taxonomy say about gas and nuclear? Well, first and foremost, the recent decisions of the EU acknowledges that both gas and nuclear energy are transitional activities, meaning that currently there is no economically viable low carbon alternative to provide a stable power and heat generation in the EU. In other words, the institutions recognize renewable energy sources are not sufficiently developed yet, provide a full alternative to gas and nuclear on a big scale. Secondly, there are of course conditions attached to this acknowledgement. For gas, the conditions mainly concern the certain emission thresholds that investment must meet, an obligation to switch the gas infrastructure completely to low carbon gases by 2035, including hydrogen. To recognize the nuclear energy for sustainable, the problem was not about emissions level, but about waste management. Therefore, the requirements for recognition of nuclear energy as green are stricter than required by the current EU legislation in force. Also, due to the transitional nature of those activities, the taxonomy criteria also introduced the necessity to meet certain deadlines for obtaining permits for constructions or upgrades of existing plants in order to qualify financing of such projects as green. Thirdly, there will be an additional disclosure requirements for gas and nuclear projects, so readers of the taxonomy reports can see those activities separated from other economic activities of a given company or financial portfolio. In order to conclude, I will summarize what I just said as follows. The taxonomy can be seen as a positive step to bringing a common language in defining what is green and sustainable, but making it an obligatory reporting tool which impacts so many other EU policies seems a bit premature at this stage. The taxonomy has become a political label, despite there will be many practical issues which will affect its usability and usefulness in the years to come, like problem with uniform reporting and low coverage or even alignment of economic activities with the taxonomy criteria. However, the taxonomy is a living creature. The new activities will be covered over time. The existing criteria will be modified to take account of the technology and policy developments, and it may expand to other categories than green, like social, harmful, and intermediate category. However, we can expect that in the meantime, aligning the taxonomy criteria will clearly attract investors and lower the cost of capital, but only for few those that are taxonomy aligned, and these percentages of predicted alignments are not high. But probably in the coming years, taxonomy will be only one of many ESG instruments and guidance for investors, along with other disclosure tools that I just mentioned a few minutes ago. I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion with you.
Thank you very much for the detailed explanation on EU taxonomy. Now we'll move on to the panel discussion. So we'll invite all the presenters in this session up to the stage. First, Professor Carrie Krasinski of Yale University and Brown University, and Mr. Thomas Fallu, the Global Financial Consultant, and Mr. Bartek Sedzurski, Senior Policy Manager of ERCSD. And we'll also invite Director Jong-dak Kim of Korea Maritime Institute. And as our panelists, we'll also invite Impact on CEO and Chief Editor Ran-hee Park, as well as the CEO Jung-geun Park of Camp Korea, who is an ESG consultant. We look forward to hearing many interesting and insightful discussions regarding ESG investment from many different perspectives, right? We heard presentations from academic point of view and on-field point of view, and we'll encompass all of that in the discussion. So the three panelists who are here physically, please come up to the stage. And we are joined by the three panelists online.
Can I have a thumbs up? Yes, thank you very much. 네, 그럼 바로
So I'll turn the mic over to our moderator. Hello, everyone. I am Jong-dak Kim, Director of Korea Maritime Institute. Our institute is under the umbrella of the Prime Minister's office, and we're based in Busan. And I'm very glad to be here as a moderator in this very meaningful event. I have learned so much, and I will be learning a lot today with you here, who are here physically, and also those who are joining us online. First, I'd like to thank all the presenters for their insightful and informative lectures. There is a time difference between Korea and where they are, yet they're all here with us. Thank you so much. ESG and investment relations. We heard from many different perspectives. Understanding the relations between the ESG and investment, it was very helpful. And we're joined by two Korean panelists here physically. Ran-hee Park, Impact on CEO and Chief Editor, and Jung-geun Park, CEO of Camp Korea and ESG consultant. Let's hear from them as to what they thought about their lectures and their overall view on ESG investment. And if we have more time, we'll ask some questions to the presenters. First, I'll turn the mic over to Chief Editor Park. So the meaning of ESG, and how do you think it's going to fold out in the future? Hello, everyone. In 2020, I established company Impact On, focusing on creating contents related to ESG. So we're a media company. Listening to the three lectures, I was thinking about what I can say, and I jot down some ideas. And I heard that, hey, don't call it ESG investment, but call it a sustainable ESG investment. So To expand the sustainable ESG investment, I think, need 3 elements. Now, ESG in Korea, the concept emerged in 2020. So it's been like 2 years now since it's become a trend, and it's on the steady growth. In Korea and on the global level as well, we need some consensus on the concept of ESG. Should we look at it as a performance related to sustainability, or look at it as risk management on, the risks threatening the climate change and environmental issues? It was mentioned earlier, the Economist in July claimed ESG needs to be all divided separately. So let's maybe separate and simplify each, criteria. So maybe social consensus is lacking on this concept. I recently read an interesting report by a global climate think tank institution from academia. The evaluation ranking criteria is based on the performance, ESG performance, on sustainability. How eco-friendly are they and how sustainable are they? And from the company and investment sectors, they look at the criteria of the evaluation based on risk management. So Tesla recently, S&P's ESG performance index, they failed. So Elon Musk said ESG is, what do you call it? It's not real. It's fake, right? And I think it raises an important issue. See, Tesla is an electric car manufacturer. So if they have terrible governance, and if they have not so good, other elements, but if they're eco-friendly, should they be included in one of the good ESG companies? How about another, like a mining company? They all have to be evaluated from different criteria. And why did Tesla make it in the evaluation by another evaluation agency, MSCI? So then how do these 2 evaluating institutions look at Tesla or on the ESG? How are they differently looking at this concept? And the climate issues caused by all these companies and their impacts on the sustainability in other areas of our societies. See, ESG-related concepts needs to, be agreed upon, by different sectors of the global society. That's the first point that I wanted to make. Second, there is global discussion going on, right, on ESG. Now, we need a unified reporting system, maybe. So there is, it's underway for climate sustainable actions. Korea and other Asian countries, regarding carbon emission. In Korea, there are a lot of companies that are highly emitting carbon. So CMAB and EU Supply Actual Inspection Act and Europe's CSRD, all these political changes in Europe and the United States have direct impact, immediate impact in Korea. So many companies in Korea are so busy responding to such political changes. So many companies in Korea and other companies in Asia are so sensitive to such changes in Europe and America. So against this backdrop, European standard, ISSB, and United States standard, there are 3 different standards. What if all 3 of them become mandated in like 3 years? Then Korean companies and many other companies in Asian countries will have to come up with 3 different reporting systems, right? So looking at how these discussions are folding out, I was wondering if all these 3 different standards can come to an agreement to integrate themselves all together, maybe? If you have any idea or information on this, please share with us. And lastly, in Korea, by 2030, the information disclosure is going to be mandated. But under other advanced countries, it's going to be only in 2-3 years, meaning Korea is way far behind. So disclosure mandate should be more sooner in Korea too. My third point is that in the end, 7 different ESG investments were mentioned, right? By Mr. Carey, or was it by Mr. Fallows? Maybe negative or positive. There are also integrated investments, right? Among 7 different investments, impact investment needs to be expanded, I believe. But in order to do that, there needs institution and government level concept awareness change to drive the expansion of the impact investment. BlackRock, unlike last year, this year, they often turn down the shareholders' suggestions. So what's happening with the BlackRock? Maybe it has to do with the American political situation, right? The Republican Party in the United States calls ESG as a fake capitalism. So that's why BlackRock also feels kind of pressed. So in order to expand ESG-related investment and sustainable investment, there needs to be an improvement in the awareness and the social community members. So ESG stocks, manufacturing, service, and large-scale stocks, there are many different types. And it was mentioned that we need to go beyond these types towards renewables. So then national pensions and other institutional investors needs to take action and participate, right? Because they're operating our money as our stewards. So our sustainability is very important. Our citizen awareness needs to come first in order to be able to expand the sustainable ESG investment. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing great ideas. Well, the concept of ESG has become a very critical concept for us when it comes to climate change, mitigation, and so on. So I believe that many people do pay attention to this concept, and ESG is a pretty reasonable concept in general. But like Ms. Park just said, we do have a lot of ambiguity when it comes to ESG, and many companies also see it as a risk rather than an opportunity. And next, I'm going to hand over my microphone to Mr. Park. So from the perspective of companies, well, you may have some ideas to share as well. Well, I just learned a lot, and I don't want to spend a lot of time, but I would be rather somewhat casual. But well, what I want to talk about is that whether ESG is for big companies only. And the second idea that I want to talk about is that when do we really need to achieve the net zero? Well, our target seems to be really ambitious, and can we really achieve the target? And do we really feel comfortable making big companies making effort for this alone? Samsung and LG and some big other companies, are they enough to achieve the target? And another thing that I want to talk about is the problem of leadership, lacking leadership. Well, I believe that I'm the only person in this room who has a tumbler. Well, actually, I guess there are 2 more people in the room. So if we use a tumbler instead of a paper cup or a plastic cup, can we reach the net zero? Well, that's definitely not enough. So we need more effort from more people. And what should we do? Then, well, if I say, do you want to get investment or not? Then it becomes a totally different question. Of course, all companies want to get investment from the market and finance from the market. And some companies with strong ESG stance is getting a lot of investment from the market already. But we need to make sure more companies can enjoy these benefits too. ESG is something very important. However, what really matters is how strong a commitment is. What matters is that all companies need to have a very strong commitment. So there's a concept called ESG commit. So some companies are saying that they do have strong ESG commitment, but from my perspective, I don't think their commitment is not strong enough. So I also think that universities need to embrace this concept as well. We need what I call tuition fee net zero. So for example, universities need to nurture experts who are specialized in laying foundation for net zero. And if some universities open classes or courses, or even college for that, companies need to make investment in that. Companies are saying that they are ESG, but they're not, because they don't have experts. We are basically saying that let's use tumbler, let's stop using plastic. But it is not specific. It is just too vague, and it doesn't offer specific targets or numbers. It is like a feel-good investment, or it is like just doing some good things. But it is not effective if it doesn't have specific numbers or targets. When we are making strategies, we are so thorough, right? But when companies are dealing with the idea of ESG, they're not really thorough. But let's look at the case of Nike. They opened a carbon net zero warehouse recently. That means that the factory and logistics center is producing no emissions. The plant and the logistics center is located in Belgium, and they're trying to utilize eco-friendly transportation modes and so on. And what did Adidas do? They work with Poly to contribute to the reduction of marine pollution. And because they adopted this process, their final product became really expensive. But those products are selling so well, particularly amongst the youth. So we have to take ESG more seriously. It's not a game. It is a critical business strategy. You know the brand Patagonia. In the 90s, Patagonia made a catalog made of recycled paper. That was the first time in the world. And back then, they said they saved 500 trees by doing this. And they say, we do our business to save the planet. The chairman of the Patagonia company also spent some time in Korea, and he is well known for loving the nature and loving the mountain called Bukhansan in Seoul. What is the purpose of a business? They always want to make profits and grow. But if they pursue that only, they cannot reduce emissions. They have to have the objective of reducing consumption and reducing production. So the Patagonia's slogan is, do not buy our products. Reduce your consumption. When you reduce the consumption, you save the earth. And ironically, they're selling more products and their company value is rising and they get investment from the market. You want investment, ESG, and you want to reduce borrowing costs, then you have to be more serious when devising ESG strategies. Companies and universities need to invest in this field more strategically and systematically so that we can nurture specialized experts for the ESG field. And ETF ROC is something that's newly developed. It's return on character, actually. It is return on a leader's character, and this is closely linked to ESG. Truth, credibility, responsibility, forgiveness, and empathy. These four characters of a leader. When a leader has these strong characters, the fund is making investment. And that is because the fund believes that a company with such leaders are more likely to produce more profits. So this type of fund is really interesting, but it reflects the true concept of ESG. So when you can devise a very systematic and thorough strategies when it comes to ESG, and when you have a very strong leaders with those kind of characters, your company will be able to lower the borrowing cost and lure more investment. And ultimately, you will be able to make greater contribution to the nature preservation and climate mitigation. Well, I know that I'm all over the place. Well, I was talking about investment and now I'm talking about leadership. But you know, the answer lies in the people. That's what I wanted to mention. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for your comment on leadership and ESG investment. Editor Park did ask a few questions, right? Regarding the reporting systems, 3 different systems in the United States, Europe, and the other one, right? So amongst the 3 presenters, if one of you could please answer the question. Any of you?
Maybe I'll start. I've really appreciated both of your comments. I don't think it's practical to have one set of standards for sustainability. And the reason I say that is because there are many hidden complexities behind the transition. For example, where are all the materials going to come from for all the electric vehicles and batteries that are going to need to be built? Are they going to come from Indonesia? And are we going to destroy rainforests to create batteries? Or will they come from the ocean, where deep sea mining is being strongly investigated? So there are many hidden complexities here, and it's really important to not oversimplify, actually, in my view. I completely share the comments about the importance of strategy, constructing strategies carefully, both corporate and investor. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. We'll open the floor for comments and questions later on. So if you have one in mind, please keep them for a few seconds. I'd like to ask a question to Dr. Thomas Follow. Excuse me, there was a...
What's your question? I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. What is the question? I'm sorry. I
Keep
don't hear
going.
you.
Yeah.
Could somebody please summarize the question? I heard supposed to answer a question, but I don't know what the question is.
통역분께서 말씀.
So, well, my question is that the United States has a mandate for disclosure, right? SEC has disclosure mandate, and Europe also has a disclosure mandate on its own. So the disclosure mandate in the US and in the EU is different. But at the same time, ISSB, that is a global sustainability standards that will be published, that is expected to be published by the end of this year. So it seems like that we do have 3 different types of standards for disclosure. And because Korea does not have one specific role that we can apply, we have to think about all these 3 different standards. And we are partnering with a lot of suppliers on the global supply chain. So it is not really good for us when we have to think about all these 3 different things. So that was my question.
I sympathize with this very much. When I worked in Korea with companies like the Chaebols, Samsung, and LG, what was very important was the U.S. reporting requirements were seen too tough from a Korean point of view. And this was in the early 2000s. And I assume that Korean companies are doing better now for transparency and reporting, but it still was not of the same standard that what I found in the US. And if I were a Korean investor, I would be trying to look at something more international that would combine both the EU and the EU and the US standards, something that works on a common denominator basis. I think it's important to make it standardized to help Asian investors as they're starting out in this analysis. That's my view.
Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 혹시 그 플로어에서 관심이
We'll open the floor now for any questions or comments. Okay, we see a hand.
Need to also address this question about fragmentation. Is it?
Please go ahead.
Okay. That's a very, very relevant and pertinent question, in fact, and this is evidently a challenge that is in front of international investors. The fragmentation of the reporting standards. I mean, there are international workings in this area, and when speaking from the perspective of the EU is trying to build on those workings in its own standards that is developing, but also tries to regulate a lot of things and become a first mover in this area, which will of course give the advantage because other jurisdictions will have to, will be somehow compelled to follow those standards. So that's probably also behind the fact that the EU is developing a lot of regulatory approaches in this area, but the differences, I'm afraid, will remain for a few reasons. First, the reason is that there might be basically difference in the level of ambition. For example, when it comes to especially climate things, EU, I think that for the moment has put the ambition in this area very high as compared to the rest of the world, and also other policies, including sustainable finance, follow this ambition. So the question is how other jurisdictions will set their level of ambition, and then whether those will match with what EU wants to achieve. And then if not, of course, the differences in solutions, including also such solution as taxonomy, might remain. But also there is a question of the way you approach sustainable reporting. I don't know much about the American system, frankly, and I'm listening with interest, but what I see on the EU side is there's a lot of quite demanding regulations here. So I'm not sure whether this is the model that, for example, the US is following. So this might also bring some differences that investors will have to be confronted with. So just to sum up, I understand the sentiment, but I'm afraid that despite the efforts to coordinate at the international level, certain differences will remain.
네, 저 시간
Thank you. We're kind of towards the end of our schedule, but I'd like to ask a question to Bartek Cesarski. Russian situation, the war is prolonging. This war, what kind of impact do you think it's going to have on the ESG field?
Well, I think the impact will go well beyond ESG, but what we can see that the war brought the arguments about the treatment of gas, as I mentioned before, because the gas has been seen so far as the transitional, let's say, fuel in the energy mix, and it has been treated as such under taxonomy. But the war, of course, brought the argument that we cannot, the role of gas as a transitional fuel now is more difficult, arguably. but we've seen this rhetorics, but at the end, institutions accepted sort of business as usual, in the sense that that gas will still have its role in the mix in the transition from coal. But let's be clear, the labeling of gas under taxonomy, it doesn't say whether this is good or bad, although some politicians would like to see it that way. It's basically just one of the more options for businesses and investors to choose from in the decarbonization processes. But what we also can see that the war changes also the approach to the arms industry. That many ESG reporting tools and haven't seen weapons as something good and to label as sustainable, as something to promote investment in. But now the defense industry has seen a bit different because we see that it also can defend certain values that we care of. So I see those two impacts, that it actually changes looking at certain different industries and changes the perspective also of investors probably.
네,
This now concludes session 2. I'd like to thank again all 3 lecturers for participating. Also, thanks to the 2 panelists. Please give them another big round of applause. Okay, if we could please take a commemorative group photo together with our panelists and our presenters who are joining us online. So if you could stay tuned. Yes, good. And smile. Yes, very good.
Commemorative photo together. Yes, we have the cameraman at the center taking the photo. So on the count of 3, bring out your biggest smile. One more time. Yes, please face front, close to the camera, and on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much. This will be all for the session. 네, 이렇게 세션 종료하도록 하겠습니다.
We'll wrap up session 2. Thank you very much. There are a lot of comments on this session on YouTube. So continue on with your participation. We have more programs prepared for you. Song Hyun said, I was really interested in ESG and I'm learning so much today. Hong Minu says, ESG management and investment regarding the issue, I've learned so much. Thank you. Your comments and questions are more than welcome. We'll now move on to the next session.